A successful CEO arrived at the hospital for a routine meeting, only to find three little girls crying alone in the hallway. No nurse was nearby, no explanation. The sight unsettled him deeply, but the questions kept piling up. Why were these children left unattended? And what did this moment mean for a man who had everything but time? If you've ever felt the weight of unexpected responsibility, or wondered how life's toughest challenges come when you least expect them, stay with us. Subscribe, or share your thoughts. It helps us tell stories that touch the heart. Seattle wore its gray well that morning. The city's energy hummed beneath the steady drizzle, but the lobby of Mercy General Hospital carried a different tension, one that belonged to the world of polished shoes, hurried conversations, and unspoken hierarchies. Robert Sinclair, CEO of Sinclair Innovations, entered the building through the main glass doors, briefcase in hand, flanked by two members of his executive team. He was used to attention. Eyes followed him as he strode past the reception desk, past the large Mercy General seal set into the marble floor, past the volunteers in blue vests who smiled at every patient but shrank back, just a little, at the sight of his tailored suit and measured stride. He was there for business, a signing ceremony for a new technology grant, a few handshakes with the hospital's board of directors, then a swift return to Sinclair Tower overlooking Lake Union. Everything about Robert signaled control, the crispness of his shirt collar, the slight squint in his eyes as he checked his schedule, the impatience in his posture whenever someone dared slow his pace. He passed the coffee cart near the elevators, ignoring the nervous greeting from a barista who recognized him from the business section of the Seattle Times. The boardroom on the 5th floor was already set for him. Dr. Eileen Marks, the hospital director, greeted Robert with the practiced warmth of someone who managed egos for a living. They discussed medical innovation, research funding, and the promise of future partnerships. Photographers snapped a few shots as Robert shook hands with Dr. Marks and Dr. David Leong, head of the hospital's tech initiatives. For a brief moment, his smile looked real, but it faded as soon as the last flashbulb went off. After the ceremony, Robert's assistant handed him a folder of documents to review and a note, one final walkthrough with Dr. Marks. Then your driver will be waiting outside. Robert's mind was already on the next board meeting, a new deal with a tech startup in Bellevue, and the endless stream of emails that never quite let him rest. But duty demanded a little more of his time. Dr. Marks asked him to join her for a tour of the new research wing, 6th floor, past the pediatric ward, just before the ICU. She chatted about the hospital's mission, the families they served, the potential of Sinclair Innovations technology to change lives. Robert listened, nodding in the right places, but his gaze slid over the posters on the wall and the nurses hurrying past with charts and IV poles. Halfway down the hallway, his phone buzzed another call from the head of legal back at Sinclair Tower. He excused himself with a polite smile, promising Dr. Marks he'd catch up after taking the call. Robert slipped away to the quieter stretch of the 6th floor corridor, intending to return the call in peace. But what he found waiting in that silence was not what he expected. Three little girls sat huddled against the wall outside the glass doors of the ICU. All wore pink dresses, now rumpled and streaked with something that looked like juice or melted candy. Their shoes didn't match. The tallest, probably 6, held a battered teddy bear in one arm. Her hair was tangled, and there was a stubborn set to her jaw. Next to her, a smaller girl with pigtails wiped her nose on her sleeve, eyes red and swollen. The smallest, barely more than a toddler, clung to the other two with one hand and clutched a half-eaten granola bar in the other. A handwritten sign taped to the ICU door read, "Rivera, ICU, no adult in sight." For a long moment, Robert just watched. In any other setting, he would have walked by. He had deadlines, investors, the city itself waiting for him. But something about the scene unsettled him. Maybe it was the way the middle child looked up, meeting his gaze without fear or pleading, just the raw openness of a child who'd already seen too much. Her eyes were deep brown, almost black in the fluorescent light. They held his questioning, steady, as if measuring the kind of man he was. Robert shifted his weight, feeling out of place in his own skin. A nurse passed by, pausing to ask, "Girls, Is your aunt coming soon? The oldest shook her head, lips pressed tight. The nurse's eyes darted to Robert, clearly expecting him to move along, to not get involved. But he stayed where he was, caught by something he didn't want to name. He asked, gently, "Are you waiting for someone?" The youngest whimpered, but said nothing. His phone buzzed again, this time more urgently. He let it ring. From the corner of his eye, he saw a janitor watching the scene with quiet curiosity, then turning away as if privacy was a gift in short supply. The corridor seemed to close in, the voices and footsteps from the rest of the hospital growing distant. In that cocoon of sterile light and linoleum, Robert felt the power of his name, his fortune, all of it suddenly irrelevant. He was simply a man looking at 3 lost children. The youngest girl tugged on her sister's sleeve and whispered, "When will Mom wake up?" The oldest just held her tighter, silent. Robert swallowed, throat tight, a memory surfacing a brief summer long ago, a woman's laughter, the promise of a life he'd left behind for ambition. But there was no time for memories here, only the present, only the uncertainty in the girls' faces, only the feeling that just this once, he could not walk away. A hospital PA system crackled overhead, announcing visiting hours for the cardiac unit. Life went on behind the doors and walls. But Robert found himself rooted in place, unable to explain why. The phone in his hand went quiet. The corridor felt different now. He met the gaze of the girl with the dark eyes once more, and something in him shifted, a restlessness, a question, maybe even a kind of hope. He didn't know what he was waiting for, but he knew he couldn't leave. Not yet. The corridor on the 6th floor of Mercy General carried its own weight. The quiet there was heavier, threaded with beeping monitors and the shuffle of rubber soles. Robert Sinclair remained near the glass doors to the ICU, posture stiff, mind caught between the pressing demands of his world and the unspoken plea of the scene before him. The 3 girls hadn't moved. They sat close together on the vinyl bench, pink dresses, creased, and marked by the day's tears. Each child seemed to pull the others inward, making a small fortress of their bodies. Nurse Jenny Lynn approached with the gentle authority of someone who'd seen far too many nights in this ward. She glanced from the children to Robert, her voice low and even. "Sir, are you family with the Riveras?" Her words were careful, her eyes sharp. Robert shook his head, almost apologetic, unsure what had kept him standing there. Jenny Lynn crouched to the girl's level. The oldest girl answered her softly. "Our mom's Hannah Rivera. She's in there." Her voice shook, catching on the name as if afraid it would slip away entirely. The nurse nodded, smoothing a stray hair from the smallest child's forehead. "Has anyone called your dad or another family member?" she asked. Ava, the middle child, lifted her face wet, red, brave. "We only have Mom. There's nobody else." There was an honesty in her answer that stung. Jenny Lynn's concern grew. "Who's been looking after you?" The children looked at each other, then down at their shoes. The silence left a mark on the sterile floor. Robert's phone rang again. Breaking the moment, he let it vibrate in his hand, eyes drawn back to the girls. Something flickered in him, an urge he didn't understand, some instinct toward responsibility that felt foreign after years of negotiating only with adults, only in spaces where he set the terms. He remembered his own daughter as a child, how the sound of her voice used to slice right through his defenses. The echo of that memory twisted inside him now. Jenny Lynn straightened, scanning the hall. "I'll have to call social services. Hospital policy. We can't have unaccompanied minors in the ICU wing for long. It's for their safety." She nodded to Robert, not unkindly, but with a professional firmness. "Thank you for waiting here, but we'll handle it from here. The girls will be taken care of." Robert nodded, but didn't leave. He watched as Jenny Lynn guided the girls to a small alcove with a view of the city, promising them crackers and apple juice while she made her call. As he stood by the window, he caught his reflection, a man in an expensive suit, out of place in the world of lost children and worried nurses. The distance between who he was and where he was had never felt wider. His phone continued its insistent dance. The light from the overcast sky slipped across the tile, fading as the day inched toward dusk. Robert pressed his palm to the glass, watched the rain bead and run down, uncertain why he felt so exposed. He heard Ava's voice again, muffled through the alcove wall, asking, "Will Mom wake up soon?" The question pressed into him, quietly relentless. He could have left. He should have, by all measures of logic and habit. There were contracts waiting, calls that wouldn't make themselves, a world outside that ran on his decisions. But Robert stayed, drawn by something unspoken and unfamiliar, a kind of need that had nothing to do with power or profit. Jenny Lynn glanced back at him once more, a look passing between them half question, half invitation. Robert found himself searching for an answer he didn't have. The hallway was quieter now, the girls out of sight. But their presence lingered, a reminder that some silences were meant to be kept, not broken. The phone rang yet again. This time, Robert turned it face down on the bench beside him, letting it buzz unheard. He stayed by the window, the city stretched beneath him, the future uncertain and impossibly close. He didn't move when Jenny Lynn walked away, nor when the lights in the ICU flickered to a lower setting. The world inside the hospital kept spinning, but Robert Sinclair found himself rooted to that spot, tangled in questions he hadn't dared ask. He watched the last light slip from the sky, thinking he should leave, yet finding he couldn't take that step. The air in the small administrative office was heavy, even though the window was cracked to let in the cool Seattle breeze. Claire Bennett, the social worker assigned to Mercy General's pediatric floor, had a presence both kind and quietly formidable. Her shoes clicked on the linoleum as she entered, carrying a stack of files, every move deliberate. She paused to take in the three girls, Ava, Bella, and Mia huddled together on the plastic chairs, their hands clasped, the remnants of their pink dresses now even more rumpled. Robert Sinclair stood slightly apart, hands in his pockets, unsure where to focus his gaze. The office was cramped, with cabinets labeled guardianship and neglect crowding the walls, a faded poster about child safety hanging above a filing cabinet. Claire greeted the girls by name, her tone even, almost clinical. She glanced at Robert with a question in her eyes, one she didn't voice just yet. Claire knelt to the children's level, producing a tissue for Mia, who was fighting back another wave of tears. "Can you tell me if there's anyone else we should call?" Claire asked, gentle but insistent. Bella shook her head, barely audible. "It's just Mom." The phone on Claire's desk blinked with missed calls, all outgoing attempts to reach family or friends, none answered. The only number listed as an emergency contact had gone straight to voicemail, the silence hanging like a verdict. Turning to Robert, Claire's expression grew analytical. "Mr. Sinclair, can I ask what brings you here today?" Her words were precise, not unkind, but carrying the weight of someone who'd seen too many well-dressed strangers feign concern. Robert hesitated, searching for the right answer, but found he didn't have one. "I just saw them outside the ICU. I thought someone should stay until help arrived." His voice, usually so certain in boardrooms, sounded thin. Claire studied him, not hiding her skepticism. "You're not related to the Riveras. You have no connection to these children." The question lingered, the unspoken implication hanging between them. Robert shook his head, but his eyes kept drifting back to the girls. The memory of a younger woman's laughter, brief but persistent, tugged at him from the recesses of his mind. Claire made a few notes in the file, her eyes never leaving Robert's face. "Hospital protocol requires we confirm the girls' identities and search for relatives. If we can't reach anyone, Child Protective Services will be involved." She looked at the children, then back at Robert. Sometimes people want to help for the wrong reasons. Sometimes they see a story that isn't theirs. Her words, measured and professional, left little room for misunderstanding. The girls sat quietly, trusting no one. Robert's discomfort grew, mixing with an unexpected ache, a strange kind of protectiveness he didn't want to name. He noticed Ava twisting a worn bracelet on her wrist, the way Bella avoided eye contact. how Mia leaned in to listen to every adult word. Their fear was palpable, like a current in the air. After a moment, Claire leaned over her desk, folding her hands. "I'll need to take a quick sample from each of you. Just a little hair for identification. It's standard when there are questions about guardianship." She handed Robert a release form, her eyes locking with his as if searching for any flicker of dishonesty. He signed, without reading, fingers trembling slightly, remembering suddenly the summer he'd spent in Seattle so many years ago, the way Hannah Rivera used to sign her name with a flourish on napkins, the sunlight catching her hair in the mornings. He hadn't let himself remember in years. Claire collected the samples efficiently, labeling envelopes with each child's name, moving through the motions with a practiced calm. Robert watched, his mind circling a new, uncomfortable question: could it be? The thought pressed at the edges of his logic, a possibility too big to ignore. As Claire packed the samples, she paused and looked at Robert, voice lower now, almost gentle. "You seem affected by this. Mr. Sinclair, are you sure you've never met these children before for a moment?" The room felt too small, the truth too large. Robert looked away, unable to answer. Ava spoke up, so quiet Claire had to lean in to hear. "Do you know my mom?" Her eyes held his, searching for something she couldn't name. Robert's chest tightened, the past and present colliding for a single heartbeat. Claire scribbled another note, her expression unreadable. "We'll let you know when the results come in. You should get some rest." She ushered the girls into the adjoining room, leaving Robert alone by the window. Seattle's skyline washed in late afternoon gray. Robert watched the city lights flicker to life, the sound of distant traffic mixing with the low hum of hospital machines. He pressed his hand against the cool glass, memory and uncertainty winding together in a way that made him feel both weightless and heavy. He didn't leave, not right away. He stood there, listening for something he couldn't quite hear. Night crept in quietly over Seattle, its city lights scattered across the water of Puget Sound. Robert Sinclair stood at the window of his Madison Park penthouse, high above the hush of the street, unable to quiet his thoughts. Below, the world spun on in patterns he'd mastered: meetings, mergers, forecasts, yet inside these walls, a different kind of reckoning waited. He had not slept. He'd paced the living room, his polished shoes leaving silent tracks on the hardwood. The space around him gleamed leather chairs, modern art, a kitchen with stone counters rarely touched by anything but morning coffee and cold dinners. Yet none of that comfort eased him tonight. It felt as though someone else's life was unfolding around him, too large to ignore, too strange to control. Drawn to his study, Robert opened the bottom drawer of a tall walnut cabinet. There, beneath a stack of forgotten contracts and conference programs, sat an old cardboard box. He placed it on his desk, his hands slower now, less certain. Inside the box were pieces of another world, one he'd left buried. Letters folded soft with age, a stack of photographs curled at the corners, a ticket stub from a street fair in Ballard, a gold chain with a broken clasp. At the bottom, he found a small blue envelope, the handwriting immediately familiar: Hannah Rivera. He traced her name with his thumb. The letter inside was short, written in uneven lines. It spoke of hope and confusion, of a new city and a heart that wanted to believe in more. And near the end, Hannah's script faltered. "I wish you could see how much I need you to show up. Not just for me, but for what's coming. There's something I need to tell you. Please, don't turn away." He stared at those lines until they blurred. A rush of old arguments, laughter in sunlit kitchens. The slammed door at the end all came back with painful clarity, restless. Robert sifted through the photographs. There was Hannah, hair blowing in the wind by Pike Place, laughing into the camera. In another, her face was quiet, serious, eyes dark and alive. Then, near the bottom, one picture stopped him. Hannah, cradling an infant, her gaze soft, but haunted. He looked closely at the child, at the curve of the mouth, the angle of the cheekbones, the unmistakable shape of the eyes. Brown, deep, and solemn, the same eyes that had searched his face in the hospital hallway that afternoon. Robert's breath hitched, and he dropped the photo onto the desk. Was it possible? Had he really turned his back on more than just Hannah? His mind raced through the years, every excuse, every deflection, every new project that filled the space where regret should have settled. He pressed his palms to his eyes, trying to block out the truth, but the more he tried to shut it out, the clearer it became. The children Ava, Bella, Mia, their faces, their fear, the way they clung to each other as if the world could not be trusted. He thought of the way Ava had looked at him, the flicker of hope and recognition in her gaze. It was more than coincidence. The logic was merciless, relentless, demanding to be faced. Robert sank into the leather chair, the letter clutched in his hand, the night pressing close. For the first time in years, he let himself remember how much he had lost and what he might have left to find. He considered calling someone, his lawyer, his assistant, even his brother back in Portland. But there was no way to explain this growing certainty, this ache he hadn't named in years. He knew only that he would not sleep tonight, and that dawn would not bring peace. The city's lights cast his reflection in the glass, a man aged by choices, longing for answers, bracing for consequences. He picked up the photograph again, held it under the lamp, and stared into Hannah's eyes and the eyes of the child she held. They stared back, silent, asking if he was ready to face the truth. He sat there long after the city went quiet, listening to the distant sound of a ferry horn on the water, wondering how long a man could live before he finally turned toward what he'd left behind. Morning light crept in around the edges of the blinds, spilling over piles of old letters and paperwork that had never seemed important until last night. Robert Sinclair sat on the edge of his unmade bed, an unopened envelope from his law firm lying at his feet, and his phone blinking quietly on the nightstand. He had slept little restless, mind churning over every detail Hannah's letter, the photo of the child with his eyes, the unanswered ache that refused to quiet. Outside, the city went about its business. The ferry's horn drifted up from the water. Traffic began to hum along Madison Street, and life continued as if nothing in the world had shifted. A sharp chime cut through his thoughts. It was a hospital system notification, DNA results processing. Not final, but enough to keep the tension alive. Robert stood, showered, and dressed in a suit he barely noticed, grabbing the same tie he'd worn for years of routine, the motions as familiar as breathing. But nothing about the day ahead felt familiar. He returned to Mercy General, his steps quick and uneven, greeted by the same indifferent security guard at the main entrance. On the 6th floor, the world of children and loss had not changed. The waiting area outside ICU was quieter now. Ava sat apart from her sisters, clutching a dog-eared card, her lips moving silently as she read. Robert watched her for a moment, something fragile twisting inside. He sat on a bench across from her, not knowing if he should speak, not sure if he had the right. When Ava looked up, her eyes were tired but steady. She handed him the card. He read, "No matter what, you're never alone. Love, Mom." The words were written in Hannah's unmistakable looping hand, a few chairs away. Bella and Mia sat together, sharing crackers and a hospital juice box, their heads touching as if they could draw strength from each other. The weight of responsibility pressed in on Robert. For the first time in his career, his name and reputation carried no power. Here, in this narrow corridor, he was simply another adult with no answers, no authority over the silent clock ticking toward a future none of them could predict. He spotted Mrs. Lawrence, the medical administrator, approaching with a clipboard and the brisk energy of someone used to managing chaos. She gave him a measured look, her voice formal and cool. "Mr. Sinclair, until guardianship is legally confirmed, I can't allow you to be alone with the Rivera children. Hospital policy. Social Services is preparing paperwork for family court. If no legal relative is found, the girls will be placed in temporary foster care." Her words landed heavily, and Robert felt the familiar armor of status and certainty crumbling. He wanted to protest, to argue, but knew nothing he could say would matter here. He excused himself, pacing the hallway outside the pediatric unit. His phone felt heavy in his hand. He found Hannah's old number in his contacts, untouched for years, still tied to memories of summer evenings on Capitol Hill and late-night laughter in their first apartment. Fingers trembling, he typed out a message. "Hannah, it's Robert. I'm at Mercy General. I saw the girls. I'm sorry for everything. If you can hear this, please know you're not alone." He read the message twice, then 3 times, thumb hovering over send. He deleted it instead, unable to bear the risk of silence or rejection. The world around him moved on. Nurses wheeled in new patients. A toddler cried in the distance. An old man shuffled past, talking to a social worker about bus routes. Robert's mind spun with what-ifs and should-haves. He tried calling the number anyway, listening to the hollow ring, the voicemail prompt, then silence. Back in the waiting area. Ava watched him, eyes narrowed in confusion or hope, he couldn't tell which. The children clung to their routines, Bella humming a half-remembered song, Mia tracing circles on her jeans with one finger. Robert returned to the bench, uncertain what comfort he could offer. He sat near enough for them to know he hadn't left. Time dragged on, punctuated by brief updates from nurses and the periodic appearance of Mrs. Lawrence, reminding him that in this world, process trumped intention. Robert's phone buzzed again, a new message. He looked down. It was from Claire Bennett. Results ready. Please meet in my office. 4th floor, 2:30 p.m. For a moment, the air left his lungs. The answer to everything, or the start of something worse, waited in a simple line of text. He stood, gathered his briefcase, and met Ava's eyes. She said nothing, but the smallest hint of a smile passed across her lips, uncertain, fleeting. Robert left the waiting area, his heart pounding, every step echoing in the polished hall. He walked to the elevators, not sure what would come next, but knowing he could not turn away now. The 4th floor of Mercy General felt quieter than the others. Rain struck the skylights with a steady rhythm, and the city outside was washed in silver. Robert sat in the corner of Claire Bennett's office, eyes fixed on the window, but his mind was somewhere else, still circling the anxious hours in the waiting room. The message never sent, and the question that had hovered over him all night. On Claire's desk, the folder with his name on it sat unopened, its weight out of proportion to its size. Across from him, Claire arranged her papers with the calm of someone who had guided too many families through storms like this. Claire finally opened the envelope, sliding out the DNA report with deliberate care. Her words were simple, but the air around them grew heavier. "Mr. Sinclair, the results are conclusive. You are, without any doubt, the legal father of Ava, Bella, and Mia Rivera." She let the news settle, her gaze steady on him, waiting for the shape of his reaction. Robert drew in a slow breath, felt his hands tighten on the arms of the chair. He was used to difficult meetings, mergers, firings, negotiations where millions hung in the balance, but nothing had ever made his heart race like this. Nothing had ever made his voice catch when he tried to answer. He nodded, then asked, voice rougher than he meant, "What does that mean?" "What happens now," Claire explained. Washington state law allowed him to apply for emergency guardianship, given the mother's condition and the lack of other relatives. The courts would review the petition. Hospital social workers would observe the girl's care in the meantime. "We'll support you," Claire said, her voice even, "but this process is never simple, and you need to be sure you're prepared." Robert said nothing for a moment. The memory of that letter, Hannah's plea not to turn away, burned at the edge of his thoughts. He signed the petition with hands that trembled slightly, each stroke of the pen carrying years of distance and a new, unfamiliar hope. The door opened quietly, and Mrs. Lawrence guided the 3 girls inside. They stood uncertain by the doorway, the smallest pressed close to her sisters, their shoes damp from the hospital hallway. Ava looked at him, not with the easy trust of a child, but with a question that had waited far too long. She moved forward, voice barely a whisper. Are you really our daddy? Robert looked at her, saw Hannah's eyes looking back. He nodded once, not trusting himself to speak. The room went still, all the words that might have come after suspended in that fragile hush. Bella and Mia edged closer, as if unsure if hope could be real, if the man before them could be more than a stranger. Robert managed, finally, yes. I'm sorry I wasn't here before, but I'm here now. The words sounded awkward in his mouth, but they were all he had. Ava reached for his hand, her fingers cold and trembling. For a moment, he simply held on, the four of them forming a small circle in the uncertain space between the past and whatever came next. The emotion shifted from dread to something softer, tentative, vulnerable, edged with a hope none of them knew how to carry. Even Claire seemed to relax, letting out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. But the moment was short. Mrs. Lawrence cleared her throat, the official language of the hospital returning. Until your mother wakes up, the girls will stay with you here. Mr. Sinclair, you'll have full supervision from the social services team. We'll support you, but the court has final say. Robert nodded, not daring to let go of Ava's hand. He saw, in that instant, the daunting road-ahead paperwork, hearings, the raw fact that every step would be measured, every move observed. But he also saw three faces looking back at him, and a chance that might never come again. The rain kept falling, and somewhere below, the city pulsed on. But in that office, Robert felt the weight of a different kind of promise. He watched the girls as they stood together, the distance between them shrinking, hope flickering in small, uncertain gestures. He wondered if he would ever be able to tell them everything they needed to hear, or if showing up would finally be enough. The drive to Madison Park felt endless, the city rolling by under a curtain of drizzle. Robert Sinclair sat behind the wheel, glancing in the rearview mirror at three small faces pressed against the window, each taking in the unfamiliar route home. His penthouse towered above the lakeshore, a place designed for solitude and order, not for the messy pulse of family. By the time they reached the underground garage, the rain had grown heavier, streaking the glass as they hurried inside. In the elevator, Ava clutched Mia's hand, while Bella turned her teddy bear over and over in her lap. Robert fumbled for words, offering a shy smile as the doors slid open to reveal his world too bright, too quiet, too polished for the laughter and chaos that trailed in behind them. The girls stepped out cautiously, eyes wide, shoes squeaking on the hardwood. Their jackets left tiny puddles at the entrance. Dinner became the first hurdle. Robert opened the gleaming refrigerator, confronted by an expanse of takeout containers and imported cheeses he'd never tasted. "What would you like to eat?" he asked, only to be met by blank stares. He settled on pasta and juice boxes, simple, but unfamiliar in this house. While water boiled on the stove, the girls explored, Bella tugging at the curtains, Mia pressing her face against the window to watch the ferries moving across Lake Washington. Moments later, Bella tipped over her glass, orange juice spreading fast across the cream-colored rug. She froze, lower lip trembling, eyes darting to Robert as if expecting anger, but instead, he knelt down, grabbed a towel, and dabbed the stain, his suit jacket forgotten on the arm of the couch. "It's just a rug," he said, voice soft. "I've made bigger messes than that." The girls watched him, a little less wary now. He sat cross-legged on the living room floor, inviting them closer. For the first time, he spoke openly about their mother, not as a distant memory, but as the young woman he'd known. He described Hannah's stubbornness, her quick laughter, her love of early morning walks around Green Lake. Ava listened, with her knees drawn to her chest. Bella inched nearer, and Mia held her bear tight, absorbing every word. Robert found himself saying things he'd never said to anyone about his regrets, his fears, how he'd always believed he had more time. The girls ate quietly at the breakfast bar, still uncertain, but their shoulders relaxed a little with each bite. In the middle of it, a knock rattled the apartment door. Robert answered to find Mrs. Brown, the widow from the floor below. She eyed the shoes scattered in the hallway and the sprawl of toys. Her lips pursed. "Mr. Sinclair, it's after 7. You know the building rules." Her gaze landed on the girls, and her sternness softened. "Well, aren't you 3 something special?" She offered a gentle smile, asked if they needed anything, then left a plate of homemade cookies by the door. The sound of her footsteps faded, replaced by a new warmth in the apartment. As the night stretched on, Robert helped the girls into borrowed pajamas, his shirts knotted at the waist, wool socks rolled down to their ankles. He read to them from a storybook left behind by a former houseguest, his voice growing steadier with each page. When he turned out the lights, all 3 girls huddled together on the pull-out couch, trusting him enough to sleep in a place that still smelled like aftershave and unfamiliar furniture polish. He stood by the window, listening to the gentle rise and fall of their breathing, wondering how long it would take for this strange new family to feel real. Then, just as he reached to turn off his phone for the night, it rang a call from the hospital. Hannah's condition had changed. She was showing new signs of movement. He looked back at the girls, a sense of hope mingling with dread. The next step as uncertain as the rain beyond the glass. The city shook with thunder as rain battered the glass, sheets of water turning the lights of Madison Park into smears on the midnight window. Robert sat alone in the dim living room, the clock blinking 2:30. The apartment was hushed, but for the steady breath of 3 children sleeping side by side on the makeshift bed he'd pulled out that evening. Outside, the lake churned. Inside, he was more restless than he'd ever been at a boardroom table. He watched the girls, their limbs tangled together, cheeks pressed to borrowed pillows, even in slumber reaching for comfort. He remembered how easily children trusted the world to be kind, how they believed their mother would return, their father would never disappear. But Robert knew the weight of broken promises and the ache of years wasted on ambition. He let his head fall into his hands. Just before dawn, sleep overtook him in the chair, and he dreamed of Mercy General's 6th-floor hallway. Hannah's voice called to him from a place he couldn't see, each syllable blurred by the patter of rain and distant hospital monitors. He woke to the sound of Mia crying for water, the dream dissolving into a cold certainty forgiveness, if it came at all, would have to be earned. Morning arrived, with the storm still raging, the girls dressed in clothes Mrs. Brown had dropped off hand-me-downs a little too big and huddled close as they watched Robert pour coffee and burn toast. He smiled at the mess, guided by instinct, not expertise. The hospital called, asking if he wanted to visit before rounds began. He bundled the girls into raincoats, zipped up their backpacks, and together they stepped into the downpour, fighting wind on the short walk to the car. Ava's hand slipped into his as they crossed the parking lot. He squeezed back without a word. Mercy General was different in daylight. The waiting area was busy, voices echoing off the tile. Nurses and aides stole glances at the small party, a man in a business suit holding hands with 3 young girls, moving as a unit. Behind the counter, a few staff whispered, some recalling the last day's headlines, others just curious. Robert caught his own reflection in the glass, rumpled, tired, changed. They reached the ICU hallway, shoes squeaking on linoleum. The children quieted, their eyes fixed on the closed door marked Rivera, ICU. Robert felt exposed, watched by the staff, uncertain whether their curiosity was laced with pity or suspicion. The air was thick with the knowledge that nothing could remain private for long. A nurse approached. "Dr. Meyer will let you know when you can go in." There's been some progress. A camera flashed in the corridor. Robert turned to see a woman from the Seattle Times, notebook in hand. "Mr. Sinclair, could I get a statement about your children?" Her tone was polite but pressing. The girls recoiled behind him, Ava's grip tightening on his coat. "No comment," Robert said, voice low but steady. He guided the girls to a bench in the corner, shielding them from the growing attention. He could hear 2 nurses debating, one skeptical that a CEO would ever take on real responsibility, the other softer, recalling stories of Hannah's kindness as a nurse here years before. He stared at the floor, replaying old choices, too many business trips, too many excuses, and wondered if Hannah, somewhere behind glass and machines, would ever understand why he hadn't come back sooner. The doubt stung worse in public, under the glare of strangers and news cameras. He tried to reassure the girls, reading from the only children's book he'd managed to grab that morning, but his voice was thin, his mind drifting back to Hannah's face, her voice in the dream. A sudden commotion drew everyone's attention. A nurse hurried from ICU, waving him over. She moved her hand. She whispered, urgency shaking her words. Your wife is responding. The doctor wants you and the girls in the room now. Robert gathered the girls, heart pounding, hope and fear tangled. He ushered them down the hall, the stares and questions trailing behind. Each step felt like crossing a bridge to something he could not predict. As they reached the door, the storm outside faded to a hush, and Robert realized the hardest questions, the ones about forgiveness and family, were still waiting on the other side. Robert crossed the ICU threshold with measured steps, his heart pounding, as if the white tile beneath him might slip away. The space was sharp with disinfectant, ceiling lights reflecting off stainless steel rails and ghostly monitors. Outside, the long windows, the trees lining the hospital's inner courtyard, stood motionless in the morning rain. The city beyond, quietly humming its endless workday. Inside, time felt paused, just the rhythmic hiss of the ventilator and the slow, anxious breaths of three small girls waiting at the foot of their mother's bed. Ava, Bella, and Mia pressed together, hands locked tight, their faces pale and watchful. The girls hardly moved, afraid that any sound or step might shift the balance between hope and fear in the air. Robert stayed at the edge, watching the rise and fall of Hannah's chest beneath thin blankets, noticing the fragile line of her cheek, the familiar shape of her mouth even now, slack with exhaustion. In this moment, his certainty about anything his own strength, his right to be here, his future dissolved. Dr. Jenkins entered, a kind man with years etched around his eyes, and explained the uncertainty that clung to every coma case. We're monitoring brain activity closely. Sometimes recovery is swift. Sometimes it takes weeks. The girls have been remarkably strong. He looked at Robert as if searching for a promise he couldn't give. Would you like to speak to her? Sometimes it helps, even if you think she can't hear. The words were simple, but they landed hard. Robert's hand trembled on the back of the hospital chair as he sat down. The girls watched him, silent. He leaned close, voice low but firm, and spoke directly to Hannah. He told her about the girls' first night in his apartment, about burnt toast and bedtime stories. He admitted halting, but honest, how he had failed them, how he wished for just one more chance. Each word felt like a stone laid on the ground between them, solid, irrefutable, impossible to take back. Suddenly, Hannah's eyelids fluttered, lashes quivering against her pale skin. Her eyes cracked open, unfocused, searching the room as if trying to catch the thread of a dream. For a long moment, she stared past him, past the girls, at something only she could see. Then, almost imperceptibly, her gaze sharpened, her lips parted. Robert, she whispered, so soft it was almost lost in the whir of the machines. Tears welled up, spilling silently over her cheeks. She tried to reach for him, for the children, but her hands remained heavy on the sheets. The girls gasped, each of them calling Mom together, as if the word itself might pull her fully back to them. Robert fought the urge to stand, to close the space between hope and disappointment. Dr. Jenkins stepped forward gently, checking the monitors. This is good, he assured, but his tone was cautious. She's waking, but the process is delicate. There's a risk of confusion, memory loss, even agitation. He explained, turning toward Robert and the girls, that Hannah would need to undergo a psychological evaluation before being reunited fully with her children. State guidelines required evidence of her mental fitness, especially given the trauma of her injury and the absence of family support during her coma. The process would take time, days, perhaps weeks. In the interim, the girls would remain with Robert under temporary custody, and hospital social workers would observe the transition. Ava leaned into her father's side, tears on her cheeks, clutching his sleeve for comfort. Robert's voice, steady but low, promised the girls that their mother was coming back, that he wouldn't leave them. The fear in his own heart, though, was not so easily soothed. The weight of the past, their lost years, his failures pressed heavy on his chest. But in Hannah's fleeting recognition, there was also something new, a path forward, dimly lit but real. As a nurse ushered the children from the room to give Hannah rest, Robert stayed behind for a moment, watching the slow rise and fall of her breath, the tear drying on her cheek. Outside, the sky brightened over the city, and he realized the real test, the one that mattered, was just beginning. He waited at the door, listening for a sound, a sign, anything to prove the distance could finally close. The next morning, Mercy General felt different. Hannah had been moved from ICU to a private room, with monitors softly blinking and the hum of machines finally receding. It was progress, but each new step brought new rules, new paperwork, and a new kind of scrutiny. Robert found himself in the basement-level office of social work, sitting across from a young woman in a navy suit, her badge clipped just so, her posture perfect. She was from King County Family Services. Her voice, though polite, cut through any illusions he still held about power. She laid out the expectations in plain language. We'll need full documentation, DNA test confirmation, proof of income for at least the last 2 years, criminal background check, Mr. Sinclair, and if you want interim guardianship, we'll also need references ideally from your neighbors. The state has to be sure these girls will be safe and cared for. Robert nodded, folding and unfolding his hands. For the first time in years, his title meant nothing. He was not a CEO, not a philanthropist, not a man whose name bought automatic respect. He was a father on trial. Each question was precise. How many hours a week do you work? Who would watch the children after school? Had he ever faced any allegations at home or at work, Robert's throat tightened. Each answer, even the honest ones, felt inadequate. As he finished the intake paperwork, Claire Bennett entered. She seemed changed from the woman he'd met in the first days, less guarded, her words almost kind. Mr. Sinclair has been present since the girls arrived, she said, sending an official email as he watched. He's shown commitment. I'd recommend supervised custody until the mother recovers. Then, turning to Robert, she offered a thin, almost private smile. It helps. Learning as you go. Parenting's a skill one most of us don't have until we're in it. I can send some resources. You're not alone. Afterward, Robert took a moment in the waiting area, his nerves frayed. He scrolled through old emails and call logs, each notification a reminder of a world that expected him elsewhere. But it was something in Hannah's battered leather bag, a letter, torn and never sent, that forced him to stop and breathe. The paper was soft, ink blurred at the edges. In Hannah's uneven script, if you ever come back, I hope you know I did my best. I was scared. Robert, not of you, but of how much these girls needed someone besides me. If you ever come back, don't stay away. He read it once, then again. The letter was full of fear and hope, guilt and longing. She had carried this secret, her struggle, her hope for him alone, while he had lost himself in ambition, letting years slip away with no word. The regret was sharp, but underneath was something fiercer. The girls needed him now. It was no longer a matter of choice or timing. It was the only thing that mattered. With new resolve, Robert spent the afternoon calling references. He knocked on Mrs. Brown's door. She agreed without hesitation. At the Sinclair Building's lobby, he asked the doorman, who hesitated, then nodded, moved by the sight of 3 small girls clinging to their father's coat on rainy nights. Robert filled out more forms, scanned documents, signed every paper. By evening, his hands ached and his mind spun with the unfamiliar tasks of guardianship school forms, health insurance, aftercare, snacks, bedtime routines. Each small detail felt heavier than a business deal. Late in the day, the social worker from King County called. Her tone was formal, her words clipped but clear. Mr. Sinclair, the initial review is complete. There will be a family court hearing next week. Until then, maintain your current arrangements. We'll be in touch if we need anything else. He thanked her and stood in the quiet hallway, the weight of responsibility settling deeper on his shoulders. Claire passed by, pausing just long enough to say, "Don't let the forms scare you. The hard part is the waiting." As he left, Robert clutched Hannah's letter in his pocket. Outside, the city was still, its lights reflected in puddles, every step echoing with the promise of change, and a faint sense that this time he wouldn't walk away. The morning rain had faded by the time Robert arrived at the courthouse, but the world still felt gray and unyielding. He stood in the marble hallway of the King County Family Court, his suit pressed, shoes shined, every detail meant to project stability. At his side, Ava, Bella, and Mia clung to each other, shoes too tight, new dresses stiff with unfamiliarity. Claire Bennett walked ahead, her calm presence a silent anchor. Inside courtroom 6, the air was dry and cold, echoing with the shuffle of papers and the hush of people trying not to stare. The judge, Miller, sat tall behind the bench. His eyes scanned the files, then lingered on the 3 girls sitting quietly, legs swinging above the floor. The family services representative, a sharp-eyed woman named Redding, called the hearing to order. On the opposite side, a court-appointed child advocate sorted a stack of documents, her gaze flicking from the girls to Robert, then back to the girls. Robert's name was called. He rose, nerves tightening in his chest, but he kept his voice level. He answered questions about his income, his home, and his work schedule. Redding pressed further, her questions barbed but fair. Why had he been absent for so long? Why come back now, in the middle of crisis? Where had he been when Hannah needed him most? Each word stung with a truth he could not deny. He looked at the girls. Ava's eyes, so much like Hannah's, watched him with a quiet hope. Mia squeezed Bella's hand, fingers trembling. Claire spoke next. Her words were clear and steady as she explained the steps Robert had taken late nights at the hospital, learning to braid hair and make grilled cheese, asking neighbors for references, showing up for every appointment. "He's not running," she said. "He's learning. He's here." The child advocate's turn came. She read from Hannah's medical file, then looked directly at Robert. "Do you understand that parenting is more than shelter and food? These girls have lived with uncertainty for years. They need to know you're not leaving again." He swallowed, feeling the weight of every mistake. The judge leaned forward, his eyes sharp and direct. "Mr. Sinclair, you can give them comfort and opportunities, but what makes you worthy of their trust?" Robert drew a shaky breath. He could have talked about business, about success, but none of that mattered now. "I failed before. I'm not here to fix the past. I'm here to fight for their future. I can't erase the years I was gone, but I'm here now, every day, as long as they'll have me." Silence followed. For a moment, only the sound of Ava's feet tapping gently on the floor filled the space. The judge closed the file, eyes unreadable. He spoke. "The court grants Mr. Sinclair interim custody. The girls will remain with him under continued supervision. Final placement will depend on the mother's recovery and further assessment." There was no applause, no smiles, just a quiet release of breath, the kind that leaves a mark. Robert reached for Ava's hand. She let him hold it, not quite trusting, but not pulling away either. As they walked out of the courtroom, rain streaked the windows, blurring the city outside. In the reflection, Robert saw the outline of a family that was still trying to form, each step a fragile truce with hope, and the day not yet done. The hours seemed to stretch endlessly, each one a quiet echo of a life paused. Robert's days had shifted into a rhythm he barely recognized, feeding the girls, wiping away tears, calming bedtime fears, and attending parenting classes that challenged every assumption he once held. Sinclair Innovations was no longer the center of his world. His presence at the office waned as his focus turned wholly to the three small faces now calling him Daddy without hesitation. It was both a triumph and a torment. The community around Madison Park watched quietly, their eyes veiling unspoken judgments. Some co-workers exchanged furtive glances when Robert entered the office, whispers hovering like a cold draft. Neighbors nodded politely, yet their smiles rarely reached their eyes. The gulf between Robert's world and theirs was palpable, a chasm shaped by years of absence and silence. At home, the girls were slowly unraveling the mystery of their lives. "Where's Mommy Ava?" asked one afternoon, clutching her worn teddy bear. Bella, with her curls slipping from tiny clips, looked up with wide eyes. Mia, barely 7, repeated the question more than once, her voice soft but insistent. Robert hesitated. For years, he had avoided this conversation, fearing it would open wounds too deep to heal. But now, sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, he found himself tracing memories as he spoke quietly. He told them of his youth, of a young man blinded by ambition, overwhelmed by fears he couldn't name, and too selfish to stay when Hannah needed him most. The girls listened in silence, absorbing pieces of a past they hadn't known existed, a past filled with mistakes and regrets. Each daddy that fell from their lips was a small victory, a fragile thread weaving them closer, but it also tugged at Robert's heart, reminding him of the years lost, the moments never shared, and the mother's absence that haunted their days. Outside the walls of his apartment, the legal battle loomed. His attorney, a pragmatic woman named Jenkins, called with news that set his heart racing. Hannah, after months of recovery, had finally regained enough awareness to participate in the upcoming family hearing. The fate of their fragile family would soon be decided. Robert hung up the phone and stared out at the gray Seattle sky. The city felt heavy with anticipation. The waiting had been a test of endurance and will, but now the moment of truth was near. He clenched his fists, the weight of past mistakes and future hopes pressing down, and wondered if the fragile threads they had woven could hold through the storm to come. She didn't speak, but her eyes held 1,000 unspoken stories, waiting to be heard. The day Hannah was allowed to leave the intensive care unit arrived like a quiet dawn, breaking through long-held shadows. Mercy General Hospital set aside a small conference room for what felt more like a delicate negotiation than a family reunion. The walls, pale and unadorned, reflected the tension simmering beneath the surface. Social workers, attorneys, and Dr. Jenkins filled the room with their watchful presence. Each person took their place around the polished table, a silent choreography dictated by legal and medical necessity rather than the warmth one would expect from a family gathering. Robert sat at one end, his posture rigid, his gaze careful and deliberate. Across from him, Hannah's face was a canvas of fragile hope and deep scars. The years had carved lines not only on her skin, but in her eyes, the softening once replaced by anger, now tempered by exhaustion and a yearning for forgiveness. Their 3 daughters, their shared future, were the fragile bridge between 2 worlds torn apart by absence and regret. The moment the girls saw their mother, the room's cold atmosphere thawed just a little. They ran forward with the reckless abandon only children possess, arms flung wide to embrace the woman who had been more a memory than a presence for so long. Hannah's face lit up, a radiant but trembling smile breaking through tears as she held each girl tightly. It was a moment both beautiful and precarious, a fragile thread weaving back what time had tried to unravel. Yet the room quickly returned to its formal gravity. Dr. Jenkins, steady and compassionate, addressed Hannah directly, gently probing the status of her mental health. The questions were clinical, necessary, but they cut sharply into the fragile joy of reunion. The social services representative followed, raising concerns about Hannah's capacity to care for 3 young children after such a long and difficult struggle. The weight of the questions hung heavily in the room. Hannah, her voice soft but steady, offered a revelation that shifted the air, a confession that, until recently, she had contemplated leaving Seattle forever. She spoke of a letter she had written, a note filled with despair, a moment when hopelessness almost stole her will to live. But her daughters, she said, were the tether that pulled her back from the edge, the reason she stayed, the reason she fought to breathe another day. Silence followed her words, thick and profound. It was Claire Bennett who finally rose, her voice unwavering as she recounted the journey Robert had endured since the truth surfaced. She painted a portrait, not of a perfect man, but of one transformed, a man who had wrestled with his demons and emerged determined to claim his place in his daughters' lives. Claire's words were a shield, a plea for the court to recognize the profound change within Robert and the undeniable bond he had begun to build with his children. The atmosphere oscillated between pain and tentative hope, mistrust and the fragile light of reconciliation. The air seemed charged with possibility, a turning point forged in vulnerability and truth. Then, Judge Miller spoke. His voice carried the authority of the law, but also the quiet understanding of a man who had seen countless families torn apart and sometimes made whole again. He declared that custody would be considered jointly, an arrangement contingent upon both Robert and Hannah committing to long-term family counseling, a chance to heal, not just to parent. Robert exhaled slowly, the gravity of the moment sinking deep. He met Hannah's eyes, seeing not a stranger or adversary, but a fellow traveler, scarred by pain but yearning for connection. For the first time in years, the distance between them seemed to waver, offering a glimpse of something that might be reclaimed. The girls nestled between their parents, unaware of the fragile threads holding their family together, but instinctively sensing the shift. The room was heavy with unspoken promises, the kind that would take years to fulfill, but were no less real. The rain tapped softly against the window, a steady rhythm beneath the silence that followed. Neither Robert nor Hannah spoke as they left the room, but the look they shared was different, less guarded, edged with hope. She didn't look back, but he knew something had changed. News of Robert's unexpected family reunion spread rapidly through Seattle's media circles. Outside Mercy General Hospital, reporters gathered with microphones and cameras, their voices rising in a mix of curiosity and judgment as they speculated about the secret family of the Sinclair Innovation CEO. Passers-by slowed their steps to catch glimpses of the crowd, whispering rumors that twisted like shadows down the sidewalks. The air was thick with scrutiny, suspicion, and the kind of quiet condemnation that gnawed at a person's spirit. Inside the walls of Sinclair Innovations, the atmosphere was no less tense. Shareholders voiced concerns over Robert's sudden absence from his executive role, fearing the impact on stock prices and the company's reputation. The boardroom buzzed with uneasy speculation. Some saw the CEO's detour into fatherhood as a distraction. Others worried about the stability of leadership. Employees exchanged wary glances, unsure whether Robert's return would signal strength or fragility. The divide among them mirrored the wider social skepticism. Robert faced a man judged not just for his business decisions, but for his personal failings and attempts at redemption. Among the skeptics, one unexpected figure emerged: Mrs. Brown, the widow who lived in the apartment below Robert's penthouse. Known for her sharp tongue and independent spirit, she had initially been wary of the disruption caused by the 3 children. Yet, as the media frenzy intensified, Mrs. Brown transformed into an unlikely protector. She stood her ground, confronting reporters who sought to pry too deeply into the girls' lives, shielding them with a fierce, protective resolve that surprised even Robert. Her actions became a quiet testament to the bonds that could form in the face of adversity, beyond wealth and social standing. Robert, feeling the weight of public judgment and internal company doubts, resolved to take control of the narrative. He arranged a small press conference at Sinclair's headquarters in South Lake Union. The room was filled with familiar faces, journalists, colleagues, and a few lingering skeptics. The hum of cameras and murmurs faded as Robert stepped forward, his voice steady but earnest. He spoke plainly about his family's ordeal, acknowledging past mistakes without excuses. He described his commitment to his daughters, emphasizing that while the path had been rocky, his resolve was unshaken. He pledged responsibility for their future and for the company's continued success. The room listened, some with skepticism, others with a growing respect for his candor. Amid the audience, a seasoned employee who had long harbored doubts about Robert's priorities surprised everyone. Rising from his seat, he voiced his support not just for the CEO's leadership, but for his effort to balance personal redemption with professional duties. His words echoed through the room, breaking down barriers of judgment and opening a door to renewed trust. Robert felt a shift within himself, a movement from anxiety toward determination. The path ahead was uncertain, but he understood that only truth and perseverance could dismantle the walls of social bias and rebuild the fractured trust of those around him. His daughters' faces, the reason for this struggle, anchored his resolve. As the conference ended, social media began to buzz with a heartfelt article chronicling the Sinclair family's recovery journey. The story resonated deeply, spreading hope and raising expectations for the upcoming court hearing that would decide their fate. The public, once quick to judge, now watched with a newfound empathy and curiosity. The weight of scrutiny lingered, but so did a fragile promise, a chance for healing, for acceptance, and for a future rebuilt, not just on paper, but on the raw and honest truths of a family reunited. She didn't look back, but he knew. Something had changed. The King County Family Court was packed that morning, the air heavy with anticipation and a tension that wrapped tightly around everyone inside. Reporters jostled for position, their pens ready, and cameras poised to capture every expression. Among the crowd, neighbors, friends, and strangers all bore witness to a chapter of a family story that had captured the city's attention. At the center of it all, Robert and Hannah sat side by side, flanked by their 3 daughters who clung to their hands tightly, the youngest small fingers trembling slightly in her father's grasp. The courtroom's sterile walls seemed colder than usual, pressing down on the fragile hopes that hovered there. Across from them sat the representatives from King County's Department of Family Services, their faces etched with the authority of law and procedure. The judge, Miller, presided with a measured gaze, his eyes scanning the courtroom with the calm impartiality expected of his role, but with a faint undercurrent of empathy that softened his demeanor. Beside the department's legal counsel, there was a quiet intensity in their approach, a determination to ensure that the children's welfare remained paramount, a cautious skepticism towards Robert's sudden emergence into the family's life. The proceedings began with the department's lawyer revisiting the shadows of the past. Robert's absence through the children's early years, his previous detachment, and the lingering questions about Hannah's mental health struggles. These were not points made lightly, but with the weight of concern that underscored the difficulty of the court's task. The lawyer painted a picture of instability, urging caution and vigilance, reminding the court of the risks involved in handing over custody. Then came the unexpected moment when Hannah rose from her seat. Her voice, though soft, carried through the room with a steady resolve. She spoke candidly about her long and painful journey toward recovery, the battles she had fought, not just against illness, but against the isolation and despair that had nearly consumed her. She acknowledged her flaws, but spoke with conviction about the progress made, the daily effort to heal, and the profound changes she had witnessed in Robert, the man who had returned to fight for their family. Her words were heartfelt, reaching beyond legal argument to the very core of what it meant to be a parent fighting for her children's happiness. Robert's eyes found hers across the courtroom. The moment was raw and real, a silent exchange that spoke of forgiveness, understanding, and the fragile trust they were rebuilding. He remained seated, listening intently as Hannah recounted how the girls had flourished in his care, how their laughter filled the home in a way it hadn't before, how, for the first time, they seemed truly content. He could see the weight of her honesty settle into the room, softening hardened positions. Claire Bennett, standing quietly at the side, was then called to speak. Her testimony was measured, outlining Robert's steady commitment to learning, growing, and providing a stable environment. She emphasized the importance of both parents confronting their pasts if the children were to have any chance at emotional wholeness. Her voice, calm but firm, spoke to the complexities of family healing, the non-linear path toward restoration, and the vital role of mutual acknowledgement. Judge Miller leaned forward as the tension in the courtroom reached its peak. After moments of silence that felt like hours, he delivered a verdict that surprised many. He granted joint guardianship to Robert and Hannah, but with the crucial stipulation of regular monitoring by family psychologists for at least the first year. It was a decision that balanced hope with caution, recognizing the efforts made while underscoring the ongoing responsibility required. The courtroom seemed to exhale collectively, a mixture of relief, joy, and tears filling the space. The three girls broke free from their seats and rushed into their parents' arms. It was the first embrace they'd shared in years, tight, trembling, full of unspoken promises. Robert's eyes glistened with tears he no longer tried to hide, his arms wrapping around his family with a fierce protectiveness. Hannah rested her head against his shoulder, the weight of past pain momentarily lifted by this fragile victory. As the session ended, a reporter approached Robert, her voice gentle but direct. "Mr. Sinclair, what would you say is the most important thing you've done in this whole process?" He looked down at his daughters, their faces glowing with innocence and hope. His voice was steady, carrying the quiet power of a man who had learned the true meaning of presence. "I showed up. That's what matters." She didn't look back, but he knew. Something had changed. The Sinclair family arrived home late afternoon, their car weaving quietly through the tree-lined streets of Madison Park. The neighborhood, framed by towering pines and the distant shimmer of Lake Washington, held a softness that Robert hadn't noticed in years. The apartment awaited them, perched just above the calm waters, its windows catching the last rays of sunlight. For once, the familiar structure felt less like a symbol of solitude and more like a sanctuary. Inside, Hannah, Robert, and the three girls, Ava, Bella, and Mia, moved with a new rhythm. The weight of legal battles and hospital corridors lingered but softened with each passing moment here. The children, energized by the promise of home, scattered about the living room, unpacking their small bags and speaking softly among themselves. The walls bore the vibrant traces of their creativity. The refrigerator was adorned with colorful drawings of smiling faces, rainbows, and bold letters spelling home. Hannah looked across the room at Robert. There was no longer any trace of the suspicion or pain that had clouded her eyes in their first tentative meetings. Instead, a quiet gratitude settled there, warm and genuine. Her voice was low but steady as she said, "Thank you for coming back." Robert nodded, his gaze lingering on the three girls as they huddled together, giggling over a game Bella had just invented. He felt a flutter of hope, fragile but persistent, weaving itself into the fabric of their family. That evening, they shared a simple dinner prepared together. The kitchen buzzed with the laughter of children and the clinking of utensils, a melody Robert thought he'd lost forever. Hannah watched Robert peel apples for the girls' dessert, a task once trivial but now weighted with meaning. The moments of everyday life, once absent or overlooked, were now the pillars holding up their new beginning. After dinner, Robert stepped outside onto the porch that overlooked the lake. The water stretched endlessly, reflecting the stars like scattered diamonds. The breeze carried the scent of pine and the faint hum of distant city life. He allowed himself a quiet breath. The vastness before him, a reminder of how much had changed and how much remained to be healed. He pulled out his phone and dialed Claire Bennett. When she answered, he spoke simply, "Thank you for believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself." Claire's voice was gentle, filled with the understanding born of shared struggle and quiet victories. They spoke briefly about the future, about the commitment needed to keep this fragile peace intact. Later, as the evening deepened, a soft knock came at the door. It was Mrs. Brown, their downstairs neighbor, holding a tin of homemade apple pie. Her eyes twinkled with warmth beneath the soft glow of the porch light. She said quietly, You finally look like a family. Robert invited her in, feeling the weight of those words settle in his chest. It wasn't the pie or the compliments that mattered most. It was the acknowledgement of something he had fought to reclaim presence, belonging, and the slow mending of what had once been broken. The family gathered once more in the living room, the soft hum of the night outside, a contrast to the warmth inside. The girls nestled against their parents, drawing comfort from the embrace that had become their anchor. Robert's heart swelled, not with pride or accomplishment, but with a deep, unspoken understanding that healing did not come from grand gestures, but from the daily act of staying, showing up, and choosing each other. As the night grew late, Robert rose quietly and closed the front door behind him. He turned back toward the soft glow of the apartment, toward the laughter and the light that had returned. No words were needed. He knew that, in the end, what healed the deepest wounds was the choice to forgive and the courage to stay. She didn't look back, but he knew. Something had changed. The soft glow of the evening sun slipped through the curtains, casting long shadows across the quiet room where laughter once echoed. It wasn't about grand gestures or sweeping changes, but the simple acts of presence, the daily commitment to show up even when the path was uncertain. Trust isn't rebuilt overnight. It grows slowly, in moments both fragile and fierce. Sometimes, the hardest battles are fought not in courtrooms or boardrooms, but within the silence of a shared glance or an unspoken apology. And as the night deepened, the question lingered, how many quiet chances does it take for healing to truly begin? Like a fading whisper carried on the wind, the answer remained just out of reach.